Welcome, welcome. Lovely music from Nick Evans. I'm going to turn down as we are going to start our web talk on migration and climate crisis, challenges and perspectives. You are in the right place. This is a co-production by the IFA, the Climate Alliance and Ecologic Institute. I'm Andreas Kraemer, founder of Ecologic Institute, and I will be moderating you today. So, Parag Khanna, absolutely fascinating. When I read your biography, when we discussed various things, you started with your thesis, The World Economic Forum, An Anatomy of Multi-Stakeholder Global Policymaking. It's a typical title for a thesis. But there are few people who are better qualified to look at that because your geobiography includes India, Araby, Europe, America, Southeast Asia, where you now live in Singapore. So you have multiple perspectives and you have a bird's eye perspective as a global citizen. That qualifies you equally also to look at the EU from the outside. Since your thesis about 12 years ago, you published a book about every 2 years. And now the latest one, Move, the Forces Uprooting Us, and Odila has mentioned it, really looks at the human geography, looking at demographics, geopolitics, technological change and what it means, and climate change. So presenting you, you're a keen observer and analyst, it's evident in your book. You're a professional connector of dots in a way that very few other people are, an explainer and visualizer, as we will see, and you have a unique ability to clarify complex issues without simplifying too much. So with that introduction, welcome, Parag Khanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for that very generous introduction. And I want to thank you and Ecologic and, of course, Odila and Aoife for this introduction. As Odila mentioned, of Europe and of culture. So I'd like to bring those elements in as I go through this very brief presentation, just to at least give a few opening thoughts from my perspective before we broaden the conversation. Let me start by referencing an area that's very deeply rooted and essential to answer this question, and it's really the subject matter that's closest to my heart, which is geography. And I actually first started studying geography in Germany, actually, when I was a young boy, and I was a high school student at Gymnasium in Germany, and it was the first time I studied Erdkunde. And so I've been obsessed with geography ever since my first Erdkunde classes in Germany as a child. And it's, here we are basically 30 years later, and I'm still making maps the way I learned when I was a schoolboy in Germany. So, I think that's sort of just a demonstration of how important the European connection has been in my life. But what I want to describe here is not geography, but geographies, plural. Because a lot of people look at geography and they see one of 4 types or lenses of geography, none of which is sufficient to explain the world. The first is natural geography. And here, of course, we're talking about nature, ecosystems, the environment. And we take maps like this as static. But as all of us know, thanks to climate change and even absent climate change, there is an inherent dynamism to our natural geography. When there's desertification, when there's deforestation, when sea levels rise, when ice caps melt, the map is changing. And of course, there's so many invisible changes in natural geography. And all of this is just one layer of what shapes our world. The second is political geography. And this is the map, the type of map that hangs in all of our walls and all of our classrooms. And in many ways, I find it deeply, deeply unfortunate that from the time our children are born, the time they enter school, all the way through adulthood and our professional lives, we teach every human being in the world that this is the normal map of the world, right? Because this is by far the most widely distributed kind of map. So we teach division. We don't teach nature. We don't teach connectivity. We don't teach humanity. We teach people division. We teach everyone on earth that this is normal. And of course, it's not normal at all. It's transient, as everything else is as well. And when you look at this map, sometimes it lends this impression that everything is rigid and fixed, and these lines connote or denote, deeply, legally entrenched permanence. And of course they don't. We have 200 countries in the world today, but in 1945, when the United Nations was founded, we had only 50 countries. And a century and a half ago, the world was ruled by just a handful of empires, and so on and so forth. And many of these states are so fragile, they will disappear in the next 10 years. New states will be born. So here, too, there's an inherent dynamism. And of course, the environment affects this map, and this map affects the environment. And that's only two of the four layers. The third is functional geography. This is the built world. This is the world map that we are building today with trillions of dollars of investment. Every government, every company in the world is making a contribution to this map of connectivity. And actually, the money that is spent to build highways, railways, pipelines, electricity grids, internet cables, all of this is much more than all the defense budgets in the world. And it has created our global civilization. And yet none of you and no one else has this map. I had to make this map. But why isn't this the map that we show people all over the world? That we are investing in building connectivity with each other. And that, again, is a shame. And this is only the third layer, of course, of geography. But let me again remind that this shapes our political map, right? The more connectivity countries build to each other, the more likely you are to have entities like the European Union, right? These go hand in hand, but we often treat them as separate. And the final one, and the most obviously essential one to us in our day-to-day lives, that we often show least of all, is human geography. This is the geography of us. This is the distribution of humanity on the planet. And yet, people don't see this map every day. They may know that Asia has a lot of people, but they don't necessarily understand exactly where everyone is. And if you were to animate this with pixels, every human being, 8 billion pixels on this map, you could really show the flux of human geography. And of course, this is shaped by connectivity. This is shaped by borders. This is shaped by the environment. And honestly, the only true way to understand the world is to put all of those layers together and to show the dynamism among them. And that is complexity. And we simply will not understand the world, we still will not make sense of the world, and we will not fix our problems until we bring these four layers into a better, more sensible, more pragmatic alignment. And it is the misalignment of geographies that is at the heart of today's problem when we think about the relationship between the changing climate and human migration. Because let me now isolate one of the biggest discrepancies, one of the greatest ironies, perhaps the most perverse irony in the entire world today, and that is here. This is the full map of human geography today. This is our distribution around the planet, 8 billion pixels. Now look very closely over the next 5 seconds. This is what happens as temperatures rise. This is the map produced by the IPCC. It's showing us how temperature change affects the suitability for human habitation of the geographies of the world. And red means a place is becoming less and less livable. Temperatures are rising, there are droughts, the wet bulb effect is kicking in, and other kinds of phenomenon. And green becomes more livable. Now remember the previous map. Look at the population distribution. The majority of the human race, the majority of human beings in the world live in places that are turning red. And the places that are turning green are the places that have the fewest people, the least density, right? Or aging and declining populations, right? That is, to me, the single most ironic and perverse fact about the entire world today. And this is an example of geographic misalignment. Aging populations, shrinking populations in places that are becoming more livable, and rising populations of young people trapped in geographies that are becoming less and less livable. And of course, the cause of this, to some degree, as Odila pointed out, is the ecological injustice of the origin, the geographic origin of the greenhouse gas emissions and other factors that have driven climate change. We have one task. We have one task as a civilization. How do we realign these geographies? How do we fix this misalignment? And I didn't hear the answer at COP26. I don't hear the answer from Joe Biden. I don't hear the answer from Xi Jinping, right? We have to fix this. We have to solve this. There is not a playbook, not an instruction manual, not an agency that is tasked with the authority to do this. We have to recognize the problem, and each and every one of us has to be a part of the solution. Now, let's talk about human migration briefly. Over the centuries, I've been sort of looking at the data over centuries of the volume of human migration across borders, across the continents, across the oceans. And what I've noticed is that if you look at every century, the decimal point keeps on moving to the right. We had previous centuries where there were millions of migrants, then tens of millions of migrants. In the 20th century, we had hundreds of millions of migrants. And in the 21st century, we are sure to have perhaps more than 1 billion migrants. Odila just mentioned one reason alone, climate change, could displace well over 1 billion people. And what you'll notice here is that if you look at the 19th and 20th centuries, the first half and the second half of the 20th centuries, and now the 21st century, the role of climate change is growing in terms of the proportion of total migrants that it causes versus other factors. This is the inevitable reality. Again, the decimal point keeps shifting to the right, the number of migrants keeps growing, and the role of climate change continues to expand. This is not subject to debate. Climate change and climate migration is not a topic for tomorrow, it's a topic for today. And today, when we gathered at COP26, we talked mostly about mitigation. We talked about how to decarbonize industries, how to expand renewable energy. We're even talking about geoengineering projects like solar radiation and so forth. All of the necessary Manhattan projects to reduce carbon emissions. Of course, I support all of those things, and we need to do more and more and more of them. But what are we doing for adaptation? Actually, adaptation gets about 6% of total climate-related investment. By the end of COP26, the calls were for 50% of the $100 billion of contributions to developing countries to go into adaptation. And that, I think, is a positive sign, but those are also just words, right? What are we doing to actually help people? And the one thing that never comes up when we talk about adaptation, we talk about technology, we talk about coastal seawalls, we talk about technologies. That is important. But sovereign governments don't talk about population resettlement, right? Sovereign governments, because of the word sovereignty, do not voluntarily cede the right to have final say over the patrol of their borders. They do not do that. And so we do not talk about population resettlement, even though the single, surest, safest, most time-tested, proven, and obvious way to help people adapt to climate change is to move. It is to migrate, but we don't talk about it. And I don't think that sovereign governments ever voluntarily will. We have to raise it on the agenda. We have to come up with the solution. This map shows you the historical or contemporary patterns of migration within and across regions of the world. And it's mostly regional or intra-regional, within the Western Hemisphere, within Africa, within Asia, within the countries of the former Soviet Union, within Europe. And there's some examples of large interregional transfers, but really not a lot. And this is the pattern we've settled into over the last 30 years. But you can well imagine, based upon what climate change is doing, that you will have new vectors of migration emerge in the coming years that we have never seen before in history. We know exactly the archaeological, the anthropological history of human migration over the past 100,000 years. And we are going to experience patterns of directions and vectors of movement that have never been seen as a result of climate change, including new waves of South and East Asians moving north into Central Asia, for example, or Russia, and even westward into Europe. And you can see signs of this already in some of the data, some of the statistics, some of the things I report about. And particularly young people are going to be on the move. Young people are going to be affected by these phenomena. Here I'm showing you the millennial population of different regions of the world. Look at Asia. Of course, it already has the world's largest population, but just millennials already are a quarter, more than a quarter of the world's total youth population. If you look at Gen Z, younger than millennials, that's of course even larger. Gen Z is the largest generation that has ever been born in the human species. And it's also the last largest generation, because what's happening now is that fertility has come down so rapidly that generation Alpha, who are today's toddlers, are actually going to be a smaller generation than generation Z. So if you take the total stock of the world's youth who are young, who are not having children, who do not own property, right? They are mobile. They are the ones. They are the dispossessed economically. They are restless. They are on the move in search of stability, climate stability, political stability, economic stability. And so we have to look at the origin and the destination, anticipate where people will be leaving, where people will be going, and retrofit our infrastructures, our economies, our political systems accordingly. I've been writing a lot about this issue lately, and I've been noticing that we don't focus enough on it in COP26. We're not prepared for the obvious movements that humans will make. Remember that we are mammals. Mammals have a fight or flight instinct. We will not fight nature ultimately, right? We will move from coastal areas to inland areas, from low-lying areas to higher elevation, from south to north, and other kinds of patterns. We may become nomadic again, you might even say, and not enough attention is being paid to that. So my final point is really some of the philosophical messages and policy messages from my new book. We have two solutions, really in layman's terms, two solutions. You either move people to where there are resources, or you move technologies to people to help them survive and perhaps even thrive where they are. We must think of mobility as a human right. Mobility is something that must be divorced from nationality. That is the only way that you overcome the prison of birth, if you will. And that is something that is conceivable. Again, sovereign governments within the context of COP26 are not going to talk about it, but the tools legally are starting to emerge that hopefully we can make mobility a human right. We have to focus on realigning these geographies, which is to say conserving natural habitats, thinking about sustainable resettlement of certain geographies, and a division of labor between countries in environmental stewardship. And we have to embrace the idea that mobility is simply a part of who we are, that people will not only move once, they might be mobile, because the chain reactions that we have unleashed through climate change are not simply going to stop. We cannot simply reset the climate to where it was. It will not adapt to us. We will have to adapt to it. And migration is going to be the best way to do so. So with that, thank you very much for allowing me to contribute, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Parag, for this tour de force and lovely use of maps to explain something that's very complicated. You sure know how to move hearts and minds, not just people around the planet. We move on to Kumi Naidoo, who has also been presented by Odila at the beginning as the former International Executive Director of Greenpeace and Secretary General of Amnesty International. And I think that this is quite an achievement to have headed such strong institutions at global level and combining environmental and justice activism at that level. So Kumi, let me just first of all say thank you for what you've done. You're now Global Ambassador for Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. The theme hasn't left you. And really you started as an activist against apartheid, racism in a constitutional form, if you like. But you're now an advisor, a teacher, a professor and an inspiration to so many people. And in a way, like Parag, you have a breadth of professional leadership experience behind you. You lived in many countries and have absorbed different perspectives into your activism, but you can also give an outsider's perspective on the EU, informed by experiences also within it. Kumi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, friends, colleagues, dear brothers and sisters, let me just say that listening to Parag speak, I was reminded of a moment from the liberation struggle in South Africa. If you follow the presentation like that, you started by saying, most of the really good points I wanted to make have been eloquently made by the previous speaker. And then you said, however, for emphasis, and then you spoke for 1 hour. So I'm in large agreement with what Parag has presented. I think probably the only area, Parag, you and I need to have a longer conversation on is geoengineering. But other than that, I thought the presentation was really bringing to fore the urgency of the moment that we find ourselves in. We are living in a unique moment of history. What we do in the next 10 years, I would argue, in fact, that this decade that we find ourselves in is the most consequential decade in humanity's history. The kinds of social changes that we make over the next 10 years will determine what kind of future we'll have, or whether, in fact, we will have a future at all. If we look at some of the trends in the world today, we'll see that, in fact, devastating though COVID-19 has been, it has played a very important role in pulling back the curtains on the failures of our current systems, from our energy systems, economic systems, food systems, and so on. But importantly, the moment we find ourselves in is also one where we see a convergence of multiple crises. We see a deepening inequality crisis, systemic racism crisis, and the climate crisis obviously being the one that threatens the very survival of humanity. So to move forward, I think that what is needed, in fact, in a way, if you take Parag's 4 geographies, the question is, how do we understand the intersectional relations between those 4 geographies? And so, decades ago, the feminist movement gave us a very wonderful gift, but a rather cumbersome word, I should say, in the notion of intersectionality, which is the interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as race, class, and gender, as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and independent systems of discrimination and disadvantage. So, if we look at what has happened, is that not only has government become one that operates in silos, making it very difficult to manage a crisis or challenges such as migration, because it doesn't sit perfectly in one ministerial silo. So, but what you find is that even civil society, sadly, has mimicked those same silos. And what we need to do critically is break down the silos of human rights. It's one thing, environment is the other, poverty and inequality is the other, and so on, and really push for fostering the intersections between them. And therefore, we need to better understand the nexus between the various crises that we are facing. We need to use this perspective critically now to forge new pathways to justice that are embracing and understanding of the intersectionality of the world's problems. Climate change, it's critically important to note, is affecting human lives now and is already having huge human rights violations consequences, and will certainly cause human rights violations across the world to increase in many shapes and forms in the coming months and years. The reality is that today, most of the citizens in the world are suffering from 2 apartheids: vaccine apartheid and climate apartheid, which collectively violates the human rights of the majority. So I think vaccine apartheid is very clear. Many of us have been saying to the rich nations of the world, and the governments in particular, often acting without the consent of their own citizens on this issue, to recognize that if you leave Africa, for example, and other parts of the global south unvaccinated, you are going to leave Africa, for example, as a variant factory. And the events of the last couple of days with the discovery of the Omicron virus. By the way, it's not clear that it generated in South Africa. It just happens that South Africa happens to have some of the best facilities in this area. And I think the climate apartheid question, I think is really, we need to talk about it like that, just to be brutally honest with ourselves. When we look at which parts of the world historically carry the biggest burden of creating this problem and which parts of the world are paying the first and most brutal price, the demographic picture is rather uncomfortable. But it's important to recognize, though, that migration is rarely a celebratory act. It is usually an act of last resort. But however, as Parag has noted, it will soon be one of the main consequences of climate change. Dominant nations and fossil fuel companies have delayed action on climate change for far too long. And that, of course, as increases in climate migration is precisely a consequence of this neglect and an absence of political will to respect what the science is saying. Professor Flinterman, who's a specialist in international law, notes that as climate change causes millions of people to migrate, the rights must be urgently enshrined in and protected by international law. The problem that we got with climate-induced migration, which is probably the closest legal term we can use, is that the current conventions on refugee law do not recognize climate-induced migration as a source of legitimate migration, in the sense that the current conventions and protocols around refugee law really stem from the end of the Second World War in the main, which was to support European migration to different parts of the world. And now the criteria, of course, is torture and discrimination and so on. But clearly, we have to figure out a way in which the question of people who have not been responsible for losing their livelihoods, how do we actually support them? And I should just tell you a small anecdote. Since about 2009, from the Copenhagen COP of that year, colleagues from Bangladesh, from civil society, they have been organizing a breakout event virtually every year, and I've spoken and participated at these events several times over the years, which was to try to get this issue of migration onto the COP agenda. Given the huge significance of migration to and how it's linked to climate, I think it is a mistake and a absence of taking responsibility by the COP process not to take on the question of migration much more seriously than they currently do. So what would we need to do to ensure that we have equitable and just migration? Firstly, I think it's fair to say it would be better if migration was not happening at the scale at which it is happening and in the manner that it is happening in. Sadly, there is no doubt that climate change will exacerbate this trend. We must therefore ensure that we have just and equitable processes that are not reproducing past and present injustices. Essentially, even though it might sound like an unachievable target, the target that we need to have in our mind right now is to push for a migration that can be as planned as possible, as funded as possible, and as equitable as possible. So when we have big problems, we need big solutions. But the solutions that I want to reflect on today, as I move to my conclusion, is not solutions that are specific to migration per se, for example, but solutions that are more macro and that address the big problems of the negative trends that we are seeing in our world today. The first problem that we need to resist is we have to stop denialism. We have to push our leaders to recognize that a lot of what they're engaged in is a very bad case of cognitive dissonance, where they are essentially seeing all the facts that are requiring a very different set of actions, but they're just not able to rise to it. Essentially, if you look at what came out of the COP, for example, in Glasgow, what you'll see is that there's a massive difference between where the science and extreme weather events are and where the politics and the economics is. So somehow our leaders, just to take one example, in 2009, for example, at the G20 in London, our governments agreed that they need to scrap fossil fuel subsidies. Now, by the way, every time you hear fossil fuel subsidies, you must just recalculate that in your mind and read it as taxpayer money being spent on oil, coal, and gas companies. Okay, and so if you look at the amount of subsidies, you might be shocked to hear that just last year, according to the IMF, about $5.9 trillion was given as fossil fuel subsidies. $5.9 trillion. That means, according to the IMF, that every minute that we've been in this call, for every minute, $11 million went towards the fossil fuel industry. By the way, the fossil fuel industry, you might have heard, was the largest delegation to the climate COP. That's as absurd as Alcoholics Anonymous having their annual global conference, and the largest delegation being from the alcohol industry. So our political leaders need to get serious, and they cannot be paying lip service to the science, and they cannot continue to play political poker with the future of our children and their children. I want to ask you to just listen to this second point that we need to change, and that is how we frame the challenge that we find. And I'm going to ask Martin Luther King to help me make this point, and I hope the technology works.
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. As I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society and some things in our world for which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, and leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society. Modern psychology has a word that is...
So, in a longer version of that speech, he actually says, and I call upon decent men and women around the world to come together to set up a new international movement to be known as the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. So basically, if you look at it over time, we have adjusted to many things that society should never have adjusted to. The ridiculous amount of expenditure on military weapons, discrimination against women, marginalization of older people, racial discrimination and so on. But the second big change that I want to suggest, apart from, making sure we get people to stop denying that we are, and I'll use an Afrikaans sentence here, but I'm sure you'll all be able to understand it. We have to stop the denialism because ons is deep, 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 deep in the kak. Okay, I hope you will somehow get the meaning of that sentence. We're in deep crisis. So the second thing is we need to promote the notion that the current status quo is broken, right? It needs it's not simply a question of throwing the box away. Thinking outside of the box, we need to throw the box away. And, Einstein once said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. And even us in civil society must ask ourselves this troubling question, whether in fact we are trapped in ways of being and trying to make an effort that is probably not as fit for purpose in the current moment, because we are in this fight now, not simply to win important battles for justice. We have to be in this fight now to win the overall war for justice, because what is at stake is not planet, but what is at stake is humanity's capability to live on this planet. I had the opportunity to speak to Kofi Annan a couple of months before he sadly passed away, and I was in the process of helping set up Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity at the time, and he was urging me to make sure that Africans Rising as the African-wide social movement took the question of migration seriously, and refugees in particular. And he reminded me that he had a poster in the back of his office as a young UN staffer, which had these words on it: "A bundle of belongings isn't the only thing a refugee brings to his new country." And I like to remind my friends in Europe about the many things, and in other developed countries, the many important things that migration brings. And as Parag showed, the demographic crisis that Europe will have in terms of labor needs and so on are clear. And I also remind my friends in Europe, at least, that migration also, I believe, plays a very important role in the improvement of the quality of the cuisine in Europe. But that might just be a personal opinion on my side. So the third thing we need to do is to recognize that the worst disease that humanity faces is not COVID or affluenza, but it's a disease that we could call affluenza. Affluenza is a pathological illness where we've been led to believe that more and more material acquisitions is what leads us to the better life. And we have to actually address this, because this is an elephant in the room. Decades ago, the WWF had told us that if we are to have the same lifestyles that people in Europe take for granted and the elites in developing countries take for granted, for example, we're going to need between 3 to 8 planets. We only have one planet. And we need to be able to rethink the question of how do we engage in significantly more equitable consumption. But that process of trying to define equitable consumption going forward is also one which needs to redefine how life is lived and how people find meaning. Because I think part of the problem is that we have been led to embrace materialism to a point of insanity and to a point where we risk everything. So I just want to end by saying that if we are saying it cannot be business as usual, it cannot be government as usual. With migration, the most important connecting point that I make with climate is simply saying this: migration is a legitimate climate adaptation strategy. Climate has to be recognized as a legitimate, a sensible, ethical, and ultimately mutually productive adaptation strategy. But I conclude by saying that just as we are saying that it cannot be, business as usual, I also think we need to have the courage to say it cannot be activism as usual either. And therefore, I want to suggest 2 things that we might need to consider doing differently. One is, I think activism and social change generally makes a mistake of thinking that governments and corporations control the narrative and practice primarily through the deployment of what has been called the repressive state apparatus: army, police, use of formal laws, and so on. Of course, all of that does play a big role, powerful role in determining the theater of public life. However, the more insidious and more powerful form of control is what's been called the ideological state apparatus, by which we mean the framework for education, framework for religion, framework for the funding of arts and culture, social norms and customs, and most critically, the framework for communications and media. So folks, we can be doing good things. We can be saying things that the majority of the people, if they were able to hear it and understand it, they would be with us. But the reality is, one of the reasons we are losing on so many agendas is the communications infrastructure that we are up against means that large numbers of people are being misled, misinformed, and led to very scary places, including being led back to enclaves of fascism. The second thing that activism needs to do is that while we focus a lot on, how people are excluded, marginalized, oppressed, repressed, and so on, which is, of course, an important starting point, it's critically important that we also balance that assessment of what people have been impacted with negatively and deprived of and so on. We need to balance that with notwithstanding all of that people still actually have agency. And if you look at this little infographic that I put up here, I looked at harnessing our autonomy, harnessing our creative participation, our wealth, and our consumption. And you can read each of those external bubbles from the inside, where I really am keen for us to recognize that the only way the big scale change that we need to push for is going to happen is that the pessimism of our analysis of the moment that we find ourselves in can only and best be managed and overcome by the optimism of creating multiple pathways for people who need to be part of a struggle, who have been relegated, including by civil society and activism, to being spectators to the struggle. We need to be finding the multiple pathways by which people can participate. Let me just give you an example, just one example, just to illustrate the point in conclusion. When you look at the quadrant on harnessing our wealth, you might think, well, how much of wealth do poor people and have? Individually, maybe very little. But when wealth is harnessed, it is not inconsequential. In the case of Australia, when in 2015 the government was pushing ahead with building the biggest coal mine, civil society was able to mobilize there and went to all 4 banks with pickets around the banks every other day until all 4 banks said we will not fund that coal mine, leading to it being delayed, shrunk drastically in size, though the fight to prevent it still goes on. So what I'm saying is, I don't want to end on a negative point. We have, if we are brutally honest, things are extremely bad at the moment. But in this moment, we need to recognize that we have options to push for change, and part of what we need to do is push from below. And even, I think, spending too much of time talking to governments and businesses, telling them things over and over what they know, is not the way forward. We need to redirect our gaze to people who have less power, support them, make sure that they have the capability to articulate themselves in ways that it becomes irresistible for governments to ignore their appeals. And my last sentence is, if we fail to do that, we end up in the same situation like we did after the global financial crisis, where those with power were able to respond with system recovery, system protection, system finances, system recovery, system protection, and system maintenance, when what was needed then and what is critically needed now is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. And I end by saying, even though this is a moment our analysis might tell us that there are deep structural problems that we face, I also end with the note that there's never been a moment in my 40 plus years of activism where I have seen the possibility of big structural and systemic change. And that is, I think, the picture that we need to hold on to and push for, because this moment is a unique moment and there'll probably never be another moment like this in world history. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi, for this inspirational but also slightly pessimistic. You try to end on a positive note, but I still wonder whether we can achieve that. I will agree with you fully that Europe has benefited greatly from migration in the improvement of its cuisine. It is much richer than it was before. And I would even extend that to say it's also in music. We wouldn't have rock and roll if there hadn't been migration bringing cultures together, and how boring the world would be without the musical exchanges that we have. I love the way both you, Kumi, and Parag brought up so many things that speak to one another. And I just pick out one of them. Parag, you looked at the various maps and the migratory pressure as a result of the Earth becoming hotter, but also sort of shifting migration in some ways. But at the same time, we have the sea level rise, and with the sea level rise, also the rise of the rivers, of the lowland rivers that rise in equivalent, which is going to eat away at the most fertile land we have on the planet, which tends to be in the river plains and in the coastal plains. That's going to add to migratory pressure. So I'm encouraging you to even deepen the analysis in the geography in order for all of us to understand even better the pressures that there will be, because some of the green space, for example, north of the Black Sea, will simply be underwater. By the time the migrants arrive, it will not be hospitable because it will be underwater. And the same for you, Kumi. It's refugee law. You said it. The law was written after the Second World War, and it imposes obligations on the transit countries as well as the host countries. There are no destination countries in refugee law. They're only host countries, and it's all written with the assumption that eventually the refugees will be able to go back home to where they came from once the factors that caused migration have subsided. And we simply know that with climate change, some places will be permanently inhospitable, or they will just be gone. They will not be there anymore. So the fundamental assumptions behind refugee law don't hold with climate-induced migration, which means we also must have a completely different system. Two very important points that you brought together. That brings me to invite our two commentators, two short statements, two different perspectives to Europe from the outside. And the first one is Fatema Tuz Johoora, a youth activist from Bangladesh, working for a long time for youth empowerment, for work with marginalized communities and young women, and as a leadership facilitator in the Bangladesh Youth Leadership Center. You helped bring young people to identify and address social problems in so many ways. So yours is the first. Thank you very much for contributing your point of view here. Fatema.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Dr. Parag Khanna and Kumi Naidoo, for such insightful presentations. So there isn't much to add. I'm just going to highlight some of these points from my experience, which are more relevant for my country. So I am speaking from the largest delta of the world, Bangladesh. This is a low-lying country where 2/3 of the country is below 5 meters. We have shortages of many things, but one thing we have in plenty is people. As Parag Khanna has shown in his maps, we are one of those darkest areas with so many people. So it is estimated that up to 18 million people may have to move by 2050 because of the sea level rise alone, which is more than the entire population of the Netherlands, which is another large delta. So apart from the coastal areas, there are other climate hotspots like the hill tract and the river islands. And these areas are also susceptible to natural disasters. And we have 700 rivers in Bangladesh. And I have been working with the river islands and the people who are living in those river islands for the last 5 years. And in Bangladesh, these places are called shores. So these people are continuously battling with natural disasters. Just to give you a glimpse of that, may I request one of the organizers to show some pictures from those areas. So, when these areas are prone to natural disasters like floods and river erosion, and people living there are being forced to migrate either seasonally or permanently to the urban areas. So while that makes Dhaka, the capital, as one of the most polluted and most unlivable cities in the world, not everybody is as lucky as me to live in an apartment. They are living in the urban slums and living a very difficult life in those areas. So, I just wanted to highlight the difficulties they're facing because of the migration within the national boundaries as well. And, as Kumi has already mentioned, the intersectionality, even within these marginal groups, there are more vulnerable groups like women. So, Bangladesh has a lot of social norms, and culturally it is very difficult for women to move, and they have less mobility. So they are becoming more vulnerable because of the climate change. So, for example, in the cyclone of 1991, 90% of the 140,000 people who died were women. So, and then there are other vulnerable groups like children and the refugees. So as you were talking about the, migration as the solution of climate change, there are refugees like Rohingya refugees who took refuge in Bangladesh, but in the coastal areas, which areas are even more vulnerable for these people. So we need to take consideration of this intersectionality and this more vulnerable groups. And then, the picture is difficult, as Kumi has mentioned, but there are some things that gives us hope. For example, Bangladesh has the Delta Plan. With the help from the Netherlands government, we are trying to implement a Delta Plan which promises to make Bangladesh more resilient to climate change. And there are climate vulnerable funds where the most vulnerable countries are joining hands to support each other. But, we have been talking about these issues for at least 26 years. So have we actually done enough about this? So as I mentioned, I represent the voice of this marginalized population living in the river islands. They don't really care about COP or, the big dialogues we have with the world leaders. So all they care about is to save their lives and protect their families and their belongings, and not in a future time, right now. So this is actually disappointing that we are still discussing about a lot of things while these people are actually battling and desperate to save their lives. So as one of the strongest alliance of countries, we need Europe to be a stronger voice and, just push forward some more actionable items. For example, finance for loss and damage. We need Europe to push for these agendas because, people's lives are at stake. So I just want to highlight these points. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Fatema, for that perspective. And we'll go straight to Olfa Jelassi, who is also an alumna of the IFA CrossCulture program, and she works for the German embassy in Tunis on projects on German cooperation with Tunisia and the region. She is a hydrometeorological engineer from the National University in Tunis. So you also understand water and the challenges that Fatema was just talking about. But your focus of your activism has been supporting women. Women for Climate Justice is one of the initiatives that you supported, as well as the Women and Gender constituency. You are an expert, a trainer and lecturer on gender, women's rights and climate change, and we look forward to your perspective. Olfa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andreas. Yes, and as feminist, climate, gender and social justice advocate, living in a reality reshaped by increasing climate impacts and disaster, where a global pandemic has worked to deepen inequities between and within countries and to further exacerbate inequality and drive millions into greater poverty and instability, especially from the global south where I came from. I want to spotlight that forced climate displacement, either internal or external, represents a huge challenge to my country, Tunisia, and to my region, the MENA region. And it's also in the global level, with temperature records for this year in my city, with water scarcity, as you mentioned, with drinking water shortage, and this affects in one way or another the food security and agriculture activity, which is women are the most affected by. Those that we need to understand the gendered aspect of this phenomena in order to address the negative consequences of forced internal or external displacement for women and girls, but also to identify and reinforce the opportunities at the present. It's not a secret that this current global governance system, social and economic structures dominated by patriarchy and extractivism continue to create and maintain environmental and climate injustice. Those inequalities, now exacerbated by the climate crisis, thus integrating gender in all climate actions will help us improve their efficiency, thus helping rise to ambitions and accelerate the process, including the forced displacement. As Fatema mentioned, so this phenomenon or many other climate phenomena affect men and women differently, so that climate change affects different people in different ways and to different degrees. It's therefore necessary to look in more details at some of the many varied ways in which gender and climate change issues intersect. So if you are still not convinced, so you can see the history of integration of gender into the UNFCCC process. So we are started from gender blind, and now we have the gender action plan to encourage more integrated gender perspective into national and international climate policies and strategies. One facet of this climate crisis is displacement, that tends to lead the deteriorations of living conditions for all. Some displaced women may experience fewer challenges than their male counterparts who face their own specific risks, but evidence shows that overall they are more severely affected. Estimating the number of displaced women and ascertaining their age and living conditions are the first steps toward designing better policies and programs to support them and dedicating adequate resources tailored for their needs. Thus, every time we apply a gender lens to climate issues, we are sure to provide a more appropriate and more equitable responses. Through our work with women gender constituency, and also through my organization, Gender CC, Women for Climate Justice, we are working to ensure that the gender dimensions are fully integrated into climate policy, that gender-responsive approaches must be developed and implemented in adaptation, mitigation, and low-carbon development. You asked us which approach maybe in the poll question it's the best, and this I want to maybe highlight two pilot projects that we are working with Gender CC. It's Gender into Urban Climate Change Initiative, which the abbreviation is GUCI. We work to integrate and to have more gender-sensitive policy in urban planning. As urban settlements expand rapidly, adding to it forced displacement and climate disaster, many cities face the challenge of becoming more resilient to climate impacts and tackling their rising emissions. Many cities are therefore currently developing and implementing strategy and policies to address climate change and its impact. Addressing gender aspects in urban planning is crucial to enhance cities' resilience to the impacts of climate change. So this project recognizes that local governments have a crucial opportunity to enhance their climate responses by integrating social issues such as poverty alleviation and gender equality. The project involves cooperations with experienced women's organizations in 4 partner countries. It's India, Indonesia, Mexico, and South Africa to integrate social issues and gender justice into municipal climate programs. To this end, it builds up knowledge and resources in gender and climate issues in local organizations. In addition to building capacity, it develops a method to assess municipal and national climate policies with regard to gender sensitivity, inclusion, social and environmental impacts. So the assessment method is called GAMA, the Gender Assessment and Monitoring Adaptation and Mitigation. It can be applied by many stakeholders engaged in climate policy, including civil society organizations, community-based organizations, urban governments, officials, and researchers. And the results also can be used to work with citizens and decision makers and encourage efforts to achieve a transformative toward low carbon, low risk, climate resilience, equitable, gender just, and inclusive cities. So this one solution that we are developing into this project, but there is a lot of other many solutions led by local communities. So it's not need to be developed more, but it just need to be showcased and to made in front head. For that, we as Women Gender Constituency, we have each year with the COP what we call the Gender Just Climate Solutions Award, just to showcase real solution and solution underground. And this I also choose to speak about one awardee of this year, as I was in the jury member for this award, and also in the aspect because we talk about displacement, but also when it pertains to climate change. So the gravest aspects of climate change are suffered by the poorest and the most vulnerable, such are refugees and people in refugees camps. So the winning project of this year is empowering, among other, of course, empowering refugee women through solar engineering. This project and the association based in Turkey working with the Syrian women refugees to empower them with practical and theoretical training in solar energy benefited more than 200 women refugees. Among them, 20 have also been trained to build what we call energy for everyone solar batteries, which are sold on the local markets and generate revenues. So this kind of solution that it's existing, and through this practice we want to showcase them and also encourage and to show that many local communities, rural women and indigenous people, they knew already the solutions and they have the knowledge, and we just need to support them. We mentioned that most of the projects are aligned to mitigation. That's why I want to ask or highlight the importance to have also financial support to those local led initiatives, because much less support is available to those who are already paying a high price for climate change and need funds to rebuild, replant and survive. We need to ensure enhanced direct access to finance for community, youth, feminist and women's rights organizations and movements who adequately respond to the needs of their community. Another issue dealing with this climate crisis, especially when it comes to the question of migration, refugees. So it's the lack of gender segregated data. So we need to expand the collection of data in climate forced displacement by sex and age and invest in gender-focused analysis. So this will help us to have a more effective climate policy and more just climate policy. So this is the main lesson from all of this is an effective climate policy requires gender mainstreaming and increased participation of women in planning and implementing climate protection strategy on local and global level. The change we envision, it's true, it's both profound and urgent. It's the role of everyone and everywhere to support holistic, gender-responsive, transformative solutions that are rooted in human rights, gender equality, and a systematic approach to end this climate crisis. I want to end with a quote from Nelson Mandela, as our Kumi is here too. So let there be justice for all, let there be peace for all, let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all, and especially house for all when we talk about migration and forced displacement due to natural disaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olfa, for this statement. We have a number of questions that have turned up in the question and answer tool. Parag, would you like to go first? You have, for example, Rupert Strachwitz, question of, do we use the state and the nation as categories in order to teach division and divide people rather than look at the connectivity and the potential for collaboration?
Look, a lot of people in theory and even in our hearts, we feel that we should dissolve states and transcend states. But there is nothing wrong with having territorial units of organization. But because there has to be some degree of moderation of the flows of people, of resources, even of pathogens, viruses across borders. So the problem is not the idea of having states. The problem is, of course, the notion that as exclusive rulers of this geography, that there is a sovereign writ to exploit those resources without any kind of concern for the externalities, for the impact that has on the rest of the world, and so it is perfectly reconcilable for us to have states and have cooperation across states at the same time. It happens every day of our lives. So let us not posit these as opposites. Let us think about the evolution beyond simply the state having that sole decision-making capacity and rather thinking about what obligations are imposed on all states, on all societies. And again, I prefer the term division of labor, sort of vocabulary from sociology, in which we think of this organic unity of states and entities and individuals in a society, or states in a society of states, and the division of labor towards a common goal, towards common objectives. And so you still have states, because we won't be getting rid of states. So there's no point in positing that. Instead, let's think about a fruitful division of labor among states.
Thank you, Parag. And I think that also answered the question that is floating up on top in our question and answers tool from Daniela. I think you spoke to that as well. So I would encourage Fatema and Olfa to look at the last question, which says, was there any change you observed during the last years, especially after COP conferences, or are these talks a lost cause? Fatema and Olfa, what's your thought about it?
I may start. So each time, since years now, I'm attending COPs as observer organization with the Women Gender Constituency, and one thing that we have learned that we have not to attend or wait the change from the government or from the party. So we as people, as civil society organization, we have to work more and harder to achieve this change. And from after the COPs, one thinks maybe it's emotional or personal, but it's the amount of the energy and solidarity when we work with all people all over the world. So we get inspired, and we have the power to go back to our country, to work more, to hold them accountable, to have more climate action. From technical point of view, from gender perspective too. So yes, there is advancement, there is a change. When we compare, for example, for the first COP, when, for example, there is no mention for the women's participation or the women's role or the gender perspective of the climate agreements, now after years of negotiation, after years of advocacy and work, we have a gender action plan, we have reviews, and we have independent gender item in the convention. So this is a change. And this, it will not happen if there is no engaged people working to achieve this change. So this to conclude once more that we, the people, organization, researcher, and all together that we can achieve the change by working to have it. And we have to continue working despite sometimes the disappointment after each COP, especially after the COP26.
Yes, there's always disappointment after COPs, and there's always reason to celebrate certain aspects of it. And after the COP is always before the next COP. Fatema, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to add to Olfa, it's great that all the world leaders are coming together and discussing these issues, but I honestly don't see the urgency, because as the vulnerable states and the vulnerable communities, we need a stronger voice of our population. And, the urgency of the situation, I just don't see in the action points, because we are just, prolonging the discussion, and from one discussion to another discussion we are proposing, but we need the actions right now. And, while, in the COP26, we have talked about a pot of money, but this is not a really sustainable solution. So we need some more permanent agendas so that the more vulnerable states can actually take on this action. So that's what I would like to highlight here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Fatema. Kumi, you've answered a number of questions already in writing, and those who do that diligently then lose their chance to actually speak to the whole audience. So Kumi, what do you want to pick up? And unmute yourself, please.
So the first thing is, I just want to clarify that when countries in the global south are asking countries that built the economies based on dirty energy to contribute to the Green Climate Fund, for example, which is a critical part of the solution to help poor countries to adapt and cope. We're not asking for charity. We're really asking for countries that benefited from exploiting fossil fuels to pay the climate debt. And we need to change this narrative that we are seeking, if you want, charity. We're just seeking justice. The second point I want to make is, let's get a reality check. When I said we need to resist denialism. So let's ask this question. Do all of us know where we are towards the 1.5 degrees? Okay. Why don't we just put guess the answer in the chat if you can, right? But basically, we are already at 1.1 degrees, right? At 1.1, we're already seeing extreme weather events. We're seeing in Bangladesh where people were growing food, seawater is already impacting the ground water table and turning soil into salt so that you cannot easily grow food in certain places. The list is long. Let me not go through the entire list. So if you're already seeing at 1.1 degree, right, so much of impact, all the science tells us is as we go to 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, it's going to get much worse. They don't say whether it will double, quadruple, or whatever. Now, I remind us of that just to say that, to back Fatima's comment, because, in 2015 I was in the Pacific and in Kiribati, in Vanuatu and so on, and I learned a slogan which says 1.5 we might survive. 1.5 we might survive. That was in 2015. And a few months later in Paris at the climate negotiations, I met my new friends from the Pacific and they asked me to join them for a rally, and when I went there, I was about to start chanting 1.5 to stay alive, and they shake their hands like this and say, sorry, the slogan has changed. And the new slogan is 1.5 we might survive. 1.5 we might survive. So let's be very, very clear. When dominant nations in the world drag the feet on getting us to 1.5, or below 1.5, what they're exactly saying is that small island states, least developed countries, countries that have big coastal, lots of coastal vulnerability and so on, they're saying we are comfortable with you all disappearing, right? And that's the reality of it. So if you say you're comfortable with people's livelihoods disappearing, you then have to get comfortable. I'm not saying we should accept that. I'm saying we continue to push, but for some parts of the world, I'm afraid it might be too late, right? But what we need to say is, well, if you developed an energy system that created a problem, and then people lost their livelihoods and their homes and so on, and then they need to migrate, right? Please, human decency, human compassion, and just a sense of justice demands that there is a much more reformed migration framework. And thankfully, those conversations are happening. But I just would end by saying we need those conversations to move much, much more faster with greater purpose. And we also need to mobilize global public opinion specifically around this migration piece, because right now I would say even within the climate movement, it does not hold a very high profile place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kumi. This was actually an almost perfect final statement to conclude this web talk on migration and climate crisis and the challenges and perspectives and the hope of the expression of what we need to do and a little bit of hope. We have almost run out of time. Parag, I know that you expect to speak next, but I suggest that we close it now. You had a chance earlier. You can still answer questions in the chat, because I feel that after those words from Kumi, there is very little we should add at this point, except the closing words, which are going to come from Odila Treble.
Yeah, thank you very much. Only very few words. This is the last talk of our series. During the last talk, we heard some witnesses from Glasgow, and telling us, sharing with us that they actually were missing the sense of urgency there in Glasgow. I think we had much of this sense of urgency in this talk right now. I thank you very much for this. There was also a call from Parag Khanna. Everyone, every single person needs to be part of the solution and needs to contribute to the solution. And also a strong appeal from Kumi Naidoo that the ideological state apparatus should not be underestimated, and it's the part of cultural and cultural relations sector that actually can contribute to this, like we have done in this afternoon here, and try to spread the word and the sense of urgency, and also some alliances for solutions. So I thank you very much for this afternoon, and take care, keep healthy, and may you have some energy to continue all your wonderful work. Also to Fatema Tuz Johoora and Olfa Jelassi and all our participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Odila, for concluding not only this today web talk, but the whole series. This was a lovely discussion. Thank you very much, all of you panelists. It was a great partnership with the IFA, IFA, and all of the speakers in this series. I encourage everybody, when you find the time, to go and look at the other ones as well, as a series that actually holds more than any one of those web talks did individually. It was great fun moderating you, and I look forward to the next opportunity, and hopefully it will be in person rather than always on those little screens. Thank you very much all round, and goodbye. Thank you.